Hi, I'm Daryna. Welcome to Founder to Founder. In this episode, we're chatting with John Andrew Entwistle, founder and CEO of Wander. Wander is a travel startup that is fully redefining the travel experience. They're able to combine the amenities and the experience of staying at a 5-star hotel with the comfort and privacy of a home. They own and operate over 50 locations around the US, and they only got started in 2021, so they've accomplished so much in a short period of time. In our conversation with John Andrew, we will learn about the story behind Wander, how they started, the way they've been able to scale their business and grow, and of course about the way they're able to provide this amazing 6 out of 5 stars experience while offering a very consistent experience across their properties. So on that, please join me in welcoming John Andrew Entwistle, founder and CEO of Wander. John Andrew, great to meet you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for coming.
So excited to do this and get to know you. I was thinking about, when I heard about Wander first, and I think it was when you guys were launching your founding members program.
Yeah, wow. So you heard about us super early.
I did. I think I have a lot of questions about that and the launch strategy, which I think was really brilliant. So, but I want to start from your story. I think a lot of people might not know, but Wander is not your first company. And you started a company called Coder when you were a teenager.
Yep.
You went through the whole journey. The company was valued at several $100 million, which is amazing, Series B. And that was also not your first company, which as I was learning, is just fascinating. Your first business was at the age of 13.
Yep.
That's amazing. Did you always know you wanted to be a founder?
Yeah, it's really interesting because obviously you do a lot of introspection when you spend the vast majority of your life doing something that's a little bit painful, which I think most founders and entrepreneurs know. It's it's a very painful career. And so you're like late at night, you're like, why am I doing this? What's broken inside me that causes me to want to do it over and over again? And I've kind of narrowed it down to me and my sister. We were raised by my pop. He's a single dad, really the most remarkable man you could possibly imagine, incredibly hardworking, just gave everything to us. And ultimately I think that watching him work very late into the night, early in the morning, while still taking care of me and my sister, kind of instilled that I want to work like dad mentality. I think what it also instilled was a core motivator of doing well by and for others and making them proud. I think some founders are motivated by money or people or just all these various things. But for me, it's really around making people proud. And as you know, when you're building a company, there are just so many people to serve, right? You serve your customers, your investors, your team. And so for me, it's a very pure source. But I would say that's really what got me started on the computer, was wanting to work like dad. And fortunately, he was able to guide me through a lot of very complicated situations. Son, this company's generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue. You need to pay taxes. And I'm why? Is that
what a common situation for a 13-year? You're like, yeah, dad.
Well, he definitely gets a lot of credit because I was not in the parenting books. Candidly speaking, I think that most kids aren't in the parenting books. And so he gets a lot of credit for not shutting it down. He could have, unplugged the computer and been son, I need you to be focused on your homework. But instead, he sort of recognized what I was doing was a little bit different. And I certainly didn't make it easy on him. You have, you're already the single dad. And then also you have this kid who's hey, I don't want to go to high school because I want to work on these companies and I want to do it online so that I can save more time. And then also I want to travel the world. I want to race cars. And then hey, Pop, I'm not going to college. I'm moving to Austin to start Coder. And just all these things, again, it's very different. So he gets
out of the playbook, no playbook. You kind of
no playbook. He gets a remarkable amount of credit. Like I would not be obviously anywhere near where I am without him.
It's amazing to have your dad as your role model, right? Like you almost like have a mentor, a friend. That's incredible.
Yeah, he's also obviously like a phenomenal asset. Like he's a truly incredible lawyer. Like he works on these large class action cases. So he just did the FTX case, recovering funds for the customers and all these things. And so he's just a really great asset to have around the table. Free legal counsel, I always joke, is wonderful.
Yeah.
So certainly we'll have him in the corner.
Competitive advantage. I love it.
Totally is. Yeah.
So you're 13, you are already, thinking of, you're building businesses essentially at the age of 13. How did the idea of a coder come around, and how did you meet your co-founders?
Yeah, so those early companies that we built were just like really anything and everything around the gaming space. So we hosted a lot of various game servers. We made little like DDoS mitigation companies to protect those game servers, like all those different pieces. And what ended up forming was this really interesting community of kind of like a lot of like young hackers and like people who are passionate about software and design and all the various pieces. And so I met Kyle, one of my co-founders and coder, as a software engineer. So he had joined, and we ended up becoming co-founders on the little the little first companies. And then Amar was a system administrator that we had hired. And then we ended up starting a few little companies together, particularly that DDoS mitigation company. And so the idea for Coder was really all around this idea of, like, would there be Google Docs for code, right? Like, would software development move to the cloud? And it's interesting because today that's actually like a pretty like common thought. Like there are all these code sandboxes and all these various pieces. But ultimately, like none of that was mainstream when we started, which already makes me sound old, because that's like if you talk to an old technologist, they're like, yeah, this was before.
Well, you were definitely ahead of the time, right? I mean, and when you started Coder, what year was it?
We started in 2015. I think December 2015 was when like Kyle and I were messaging about the idea. And then obviously we were still young, right? We were kids. I remember I was like finishing up high school. And so things don't move as quickly at that age because you have all these other shenanigans going on. You don't even know about venture capital. And so you're just working on these projects. Maybe you have one or two software engineers that like have now joined, so the team's a little bit larger. But it was a really phenomenal journey. I think things really started to pick up once Kyle and I and Amar had wrapped up high school, which is a funny statement because our parents were very strict on that topic of, you guys have to finish high school. And then from there, we all moved to Austin, renting a rusty tin shack on the east side of Austin. I mean, like literally just a kind of a joke of an office, and getting to work. And then things kind of picked up very quickly from there.
That sounds like a big milestone, right? Because you're leaving. Is that when you felt it was real? Like, when did you feel it went from, okay, cool, like it's friends, we're building something, we're having fun, to this is a company?
Well, we were always so naive about what things could become in terms of being optimistic. So we never viewed anything we ever did as, oh, this is just a side project or it doesn't matter. We always viewed it in like the absolute extreme of, this is going to become a $100 billion company and we are going to rule the world. And like we truly deeply believed that. I think you need that naivety when you're starting a company to get started, because the odds are so low, right? The odds of building a successful startup, let's call it 1 in 1,000, depending on what your measure of success is. Like you have to be delusional to even get started. And so we were certainly always delusional about the impact we would have. And I think that what's so funny is if you asked an earlier John Andrew, like, hey, Coder ended up powering millions of software engineers and being used by large public companies like Vanguard and Goldman Sachs, like all these incredible organizations, I would have been like, that's it? Like, that
was the plan. Like, it almost feels like for you, that was a part of the journey. Like, of course, what's next, right?
Exactly right.
Was there a time in Coder's history when I'm thinking, for some folks it's like the first big customer, or, you start hiring, you make your first couple of hires. At what point did you feel like you were, it just seems like, I know that those early days, it still feels a little bit more like a project, right? And you're with your co-founders, it's very scrappy. Like, did you have a moment when it felt like very real, or like you said, it was from the beginning like that?
Yeah, I mean, the company was always real, but there were some breakthrough moments. I will know, obviously, to anyone listening, that one of the best pieces of advice that I got when starting the company was more of a warning. And it was that there will be 3 times in your company's history where you think it is going to die. Like, flat out, like you see no way out of the situation. And that was from this entrepreneur, Alec Guttle, who I had met very early on. His other question to me was, are you sure you want to start this company? Because it's going to suck. Like, it is going to be very painful.
You're in it for a lot of pain.
Yeah, exactly. Which at the time I didn't know how much pain, but he was absolutely right. And so, there were multiple times where I thought the company was going to fail. I remember before we raised our seed, we had been doing friends and family, and we had like a month of runway. And I had been pitching VCs nonstop, meeting with everyone in the Valley you could imagine. And I remember when we had launched the product and we started to see that user graph really take off, and we had a few technologists like Quinn Slack from SourceGraph and John Kudamal from LaunchDarkly see the product and start to talk about it, that was when the VCs that we were talking to were like, oh, like there's something really interesting happening here. The reason why I mention that is because obviously any successful startup will have those moments where things became real, like the big $1 million customer and hundreds of thousands of users signing up and all these exciting things. But there were also plenty of times where I literally laid at bed at night crying as this 18-year-old, 19-year-old kid trying to figure out how I was going to navigate this company with 40 employees to that next milestone, because like you look at them and that you're responsible for their mortgage and like their livelihood and the rest, and it is just like a remarkable amount of weight to carry, especially as a young adult. And so even though obviously we had lots of successes along the way, those moments where we got close to death really helped form the company, and also of course like who you become as a founder.
Of course. Was there a specific moment you could share, or like something that is very vivid that you remember?
The one that I remember the most vividly, where like I literally would talk to myself that tagline that Alex shared of, okay, like this is number one. Like of the 3 times that I think the company's going to die, this is number one. While I was running Coder, I ended up hitting all 3 of them. That first one where, again, the company had less than a month of runway. We had, call it maybe a dozen employees at the time. And it was on me to like get that fundraise done, and all the conversations I was having and all the diligence and back and forth. I do remember when I described like crying, it was more just like laying in bed, staring at the ceiling, like with all these scenarios running through your mind and like thinking about your team and how you're going to get to the next phase. And yeah, I mean, like, that tear rolls down your face and you're like, holy shit, like, like you really are, like it's everything you have. And yeah, in any company, there are multiple times where that happens. In Coder, like I mentioned, there were 2 more. I don't know if I want to share those because they're more recent history.
I have to tell you, I fully relate to that, and it's almost any founder who doesn't, they're just not talking about it. But I'm curious, in that moment, you're saying you have 1 month of runway, you'll have people depending on you. And you mentioned that one of the things that inspires you and pushes you through is making people proud, right? So you have a lot of people depending on you. What did you do to push through that? Like what was the insight that you were like, okay, here's how I'm going to get out of this?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, constraints and pressure are a forcing function for action, or at least they should be. And so for us, we launched the product early, we turned on monetization, just any and every lever we could pull to show traction. And of course, too, I was cold emailing every VC that like under the sun, which is ultimately how that seed round was led by Uncork and Redpoint, and that's how I connected with them. Was just a really solid cold email, which of course is very lucky and atypical.
That is also very rare, especially with all the VCs who say. I mean, some people say cold email works for VCs, others say no way. But
Totally.
But you did it without. You didn't have any intros yet. Like you were just going.
Yeah,
for
it was all like pure raw outreach. I mean, we had some people we meet along the way who would say, "Hey, like happy to connect you," but ultimately, let's say that I was introduced to like some new associate. Like as a new associate, how do you validate these 3 17-year-olds who are working on this project who have no track record? They don't even have a LinkedIn, and they're trying to raise money for this concept of moving software development to the cloud, which like is a very complex technical problem. And so, yeah, I mean, it was a lot of conversations. We also, I'm sure, we're not the most polished fundraisers in the world. I remember my first ever meeting was with Google Ventures, which they're a remarkable firm, but not the best firm to do your first venture pitch with because you're just going to screw it up.
You should never do it with the firm. Yeah, you should
exactly. You should pitch like your second uncle, not Google Ventures as your first pitch. And I remember we were like, I guess we should dress up, right? Like we should look fancy. So we like got like some button ups and like dressed business casual. As we went, we got like more casual. Like, okay, we don't need to, look like
the
bankers.
less casual, the better. I feel like the look is the best fundraising look. It's like you have not been sleeping, hoodie, like you just have to do that.
Yeah, but it was a great journey, a great experience. Candidly, a lot of brute force and a lot of credit to our early VCs for recognizing what we were building and that this was something that was a little bit different, especially before like all the user traction kicked off. And ultimately it ended up becoming a really great round, which is how most rounds happen, right? It's like no traction until like ultimately like everyone's interested.
Feast or famine, right?
Exactly.
It's never,
but yeah, I remember too, Founders Fund ended up investing. I remember talking to Peter Thiel on the phone. I was like so nervous. And then emailing back and forth with him and his team. I sent so many typos, and I'll never forget one of the partners from Founders Fund like shot me a note, and he's like, "Hey, like you may want to like slow down a little bit because you're sending a lot of typos." And I'm like, "Okay." And then I wrote it down in my list of everything I've learned to like no more important emails from my phone.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a remarkable experience and a lot learned at a young age.
For sure. I mean, and this is just, I mean, what you shared, this is just leading up to the seed round. And I'm only imagining how much you've learned throughout the entire journey. One thing that that really impressed me was that as you were sort of transitioning from Coder and between that time and you starting Wander, it was very little time. And I would love, it's a fascinating story. I would love for you to share it. And I'm just so curious about what was so special about the idea of Wander that made you essentially like jump into it right away.
Yeah, so I had been running Coder for 5 years, CEO from ages 18 through 23, a very hectic 5 years. It was the majority of my adult life. Let's say I became self-aware at 16, which can sound funny to people, but let's just call it that. Then, I was running Coder for again that vast majority. So my entire young adult brain had formed around building this company, running a startup, and so when I left that company post Series B, and it just becomes quiet, it's the most interesting thing in the world. Like it's constant communication, constant everything, and it's like someone turns off the air conditioner and all of a sudden the room is just like quiet. Like your phone isn't blowing up anymore. There are no more emails. And I remember thinking to myself when I had done that last all hands and I had rehearsed it so many times that because I knew I wouldn't be able to get through it if it wasn't rehearsed, like saying goodbye to the team. And so I like had just rehearsed it to the point where I was just on autopilot. I remember sitting up there and at that point I was in Boulder, Colorado, signing off, doing the last board meetings, et cetera, and thinking to myself, like, whatever I do in the next basically 3 months will determine the rest of my life from a trajectory perspective. Like, no matter how planned or smooth a transition is, it's a very like difficult period in your life. And so I knew that although like I could feel almost like this sadness and separation and all these pieces, that I really had to hit the ground running. Like I had to like quote unquote like tough it out. And like once I had decided that I was going to start another company, even if I wanted to take more time or whatever else, that I wasn't going to, that I wanted to make sure that like the rest of my life was easy, because I made a lot of like hard choices early. And so when it came to Wander, I was evaluating a bunch of different ideas. Obviously, most of them SaaS, right? Like software, true software products.
And also with your experience at Coda, it would make so much sense. You would just be like, here I am.
Exactly. But when I had the idea for Wander, it wouldn't let me sleep at night. I began to think about all these different components, about the booking engine and the property management software and the guest experience, and ultimately what the end deliverable was, like the impact of creating happiness. Every business has a I think a positive impact, whether it's some medical supply company creating some niche product that then saves someone's life, or you can go as far up or down the chain as you would like. For Wander, I loved the idea of delivering happy customers, like delivering this like true happiness in people's lives. It felt like a very pure outcome. And so once that idea had taken a hold of me and really started to tap into all of the pieces that I was passionate about. Obviously, as a kid, I loved to travel. All through high school, I traveled all across the world. Like I loved brand and like consumer products from my like early days as a young teenager, to like, okay, how do we build like the go-to-market motion for adding supply onto the platform, which I had built at Coder. Like it seems to people who know me very well, Wander is a very John Andrew company. But if you just look at my LinkedIn, you would say he should have gone and started some like enterprise B2B SaaS company.
Selling to government. You know how it usually goes. Consumer, you go from consumer to all the way up the chain to enterprise.
Exactly.
But you did something different. I read somewhere that the idea for Wander came when you were staying at you rented out a place and you kind of experienced the pain yourself. Could you share more about that?
Totally. So after I had signed the final paperwork for Coder, I was in Boulder. I got in the car and went off to this cabin that I had rented like deep in the Rockies. I wanted to give myself a week to recover. And it was so funny. I remember stopping at the local library and just picking up like a bunch of like random self-help books. Because I'm like, I hear people read these. Like I'll read like The Art of Happiness. I'll read all these things while I'm up there, like get my head straight. Or at least like arm myself with some mental frameworks to, like recover faster. And so when I got to that cabin, I mean, it was a very tranquil experience, but ultimately, the place didn't look like the photos. The beds were uncomfortable. The internet was like non-existent, which was fine. I sat outside and read my book all day and like thought about the world and, talked to whatever employees or investors or the like who had XYZ questions and those pieces. But that's where I wrote down that idea for Wander, where, was there the opportunity to verticalize the vacation rental space and solve this problem of consistency and quality for the consumer? And again, when you start to think about what Wander now does and the scale that it's at, it is a massively complex business. I think this is something we talked about a little bit earlier, where you have the booking engine and the platform and the brand. Then underneath that, you have all these operations. You have the guest experience layer. You have the vendor management layer. And so I think it was actually that complexity in solving the customer problem that really made me excited and passionate about it. Because again, like there are very few people who I think are passionate about the brand and travel, and then also the software side and all these different components. And it just felt like, it felt like I was creating a company that was like who I was.
Yeah. It seems like, people always talk about founder market fit or founder market fit, founder product market fit. One of those, but it seems like it makes a lot of sense based on your passion and things you care about. I think for me, before kind of chatting with you, I think of Wander as a consumer, right? It's a great way to book a place to stay. You kind of get kind of almost drawn into your incredible photos, and you're almost like, okay, I'm booking, a getaway right now. But obviously, as you mentioned, the business, everything that powers it behind the scenes is so sophisticated and complex. And you mentioned when you were thinking about the idea, you were already thinking about all those pieces. How much of what Wander is today did you essentially anticipate, or did you kind of, did the vision change dramatically or no?
Yeah, the vision itself didn't change in the sense of Wander solves the same customer problem that we set out to solve. At the end of the day, there are changes like any business in terms of thinking, okay, the first way that we're going to scale supply is this way, and then later on you change it to a different model or those types of pieces. What's really interesting is when starting the company, or before I had started the company, I basically created this document, this like pre-mortem document, trying to figure out like why would this company fail, and it turned into this like 80-page document of all the different risks and reasons, from like, okay, we need to create our brand, to we need to own our demand channels, to like, can you actually automate property management? Is that possible? What type of margin profile can you get to? All these different things. And what you end up with is basically like, okay, if we face A problem, then we need to do B solution, and that continues. And so most of the things that we changed or evolved were in that original document. They were just, maybe plan B or C as opposed to plan A.
So it's almost like you were de-risking
Yeah,
everything in that document.
it's a very important concept. And this is actually probably like one of the best pieces of advice I can give to early stage founders, is this idea of hedging progress, or at least like de-risking, as you said. So in the early days, you have so little data, so you need to do action to get said data. But the thing is if you have something that there's a 20% chance of working, and you have 6 months of runway, and that thing is going to take 3 months, then if that is the only thing that you do, and it is very unlikely that it works, then you're going to be, staring down the barrel of your company failing before you've started plan B or C. And so one of the things that we did very early on in Wander is run multiple different paths in parallel anytime that it was sort of like a life or death situation for the company. A good way to visualize it is you have like the main ship, and then you kind of send out like some dinghies to like explore, like, does that island have fruit on it or not, before you go and turn the main vessel. And so that idea of hedging progress is actually a company virtue of ours. As you grow, it's sort of less relevant because the main thing is working, it becomes more stable. But in the early days, it's kind of like throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. And if you only throw one thing at a time and do a bunch of analysis and throw another thing at the wall, then it's like you burn time. And obviously, as an early stage startup, time isn't your friend. So I highly recommend hedging progress, thinking about the different solutions, seeing what you can run in parallel. It really changes your odds.
It's almost like you have your core sort of like core mission, sort of bread and butter, and then you have teams in parallel exploring just hypotheses that are not aligned with that core mission.
Exactly. An easy way, I mean, it's even relevant in the world of like fundraising as like a very simple idea. So you obviously talk to more than one VC because you know that one of them could drop out or multiple of them could drop out.
And realistically, you only need one to say yes.
Exactly. But you talk to multiple, and what you're doing there is you're hedging progress, right? Because if you only talk to one at a time, you're going to run out of money. Like if you talk to one, waited for them to say no, and then talk to the next, like it doesn't work. And you can do have that same principle in other areas of the business. I will note you have to be very careful not to defocus the company to the point where you don't make any progress. So it's really only to see if something has initial signal, and then once it does, you focus everyone back in.
It's almost like an experiment.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So I'm curious, you were talking about the early days of Wander, and I really want to learn about your launch strategy, because I think, frankly, as an outsider, I did not feel like you guys were throwing things at the wall. It felt very cohesive and intentional. At least that's my perception. But I'm curious, even before that, before sort of like launching and getting first folks, right? So you are now a second-time founder.
what do you do differently? And what are the first things, like you made that document, 80-page document, right? Here you are off to build Wander. What are the first things you do as a second-time founder?
The output of your like pre-mortem, which by the way, you don't need to wait until you start a company to do it. You can do it for new products. You can do it now if you have uncertainty in your business. Honestly, it's more like it kind of just looks like a business plan with a very deep risk section. But what comes out of that is basically a bunch of questions that need to be answered. It's interesting. I think a lot of people who don't understand startups or startup founders well are sort of like, oh, here are all the reasons why your company can fail. Realistically, like the founder is more than aware of all the reasons their company can fail. So it's like kind of like a funny interaction to have. It's like, well, your company probably won't work. And it's like, well, like obviously.
Trust me, I have a doc on that.
Yeah, exactly. Like what are all the reasons? Like it's a very silly mentality to me. It's like, yes, but there's a 1% chance that it will. And that's what I'm going after. But to answer your question, the output of that doc is basically a bunch of core questions that ultimately I wasn't able to answer just like working in my own head, such as like, can we create a brand that resonates with consumers? Would the NPS and customer satisfaction be like a meaningful improvement over what existed in the industry?
Like 10x.
Exactly right. Could operationally we run each location as its own independent business and like scale across the United States as opposed to having to have like geographic concentration? All these different questions that ultimately I wouldn't be able to answer other than like have a general thesis. And so this is where I think it was Mark Andreessen said it. It's like this idea of like peeling layers of an onion where it's like, okay, you like have this thesis, you peel a few layers and you kind of see what's there and like, okay, then maybe you raise some capital, you peel a few more. It was very much like that the early stage of Wander. I had all these core questions that had to be answered, and ultimately the answers to those questions relied on having really great team members as well. So like on the idea of creating this really incredible brand, I ended up meeting Kyle Tibbetts from Twitter. He was previously the head of brand at Open Door, also early at Hotel Tonight, and so like made a stretch hire to try and get him like in very, very early on. On the technology front, like I knew that I wanted to walk down the path of property management being a software problem, right? Like could we coordinate all these vendors, sort of how Uber coordinates their drivers, to really like optimize and run these properties at a higher margin profile? Like was that even something that was possible? And if so, who would I work with? Ended up bringing Nathan Potter on as our CTO. He was previously the head of product with me over at Coder. And so you just end up like building this team to solve these big questions and big problems that come out of basically that risk document. And so for us, we ended up answering a lot of questions on the way. And of course, you end up discovering more as well. You can't see the whole future. There's going to be more data, things that you didn't see, clouds on the horizon that you didn't anticipate. But ultimately, at this point in Wander, all of the core questions have been answered. And now the last big one is scale. Like how big can this get and how quickly can it get there? And that's a very like scary question to like ask, is like how big of a company could this be? But so far, the core things are all moving in the right direction. Like we've built something that customers love.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we'll see what happens from here.
You have the foundation now, so now it's scaling, which I think it's fun and scary in a sense. Mm-hmm. But going back a little bit to that part, so you mentioned you bring in people, so you have all these things to de-risk. You bring in people who are going to own these areas because obviously you can't do it all by yourself. And I do remember seeing on Twitter the wait list. I think you guys had a wait list for founding memberships. Talk to us about that and just really like what was the intentionality and the idea behind your launch strategy?
Absolutely. I think a big trap that founders fall into is that they build a product without any validation, which is not something that I wanted to do. And so I had two pieces of it. Number one was a lot of founders create a wait list, but the problem with a wait list is it's the like lowest barrier to entry concept to find market validation you could like think of, right? Because it doesn't take any effort for someone to put in their email address into a product. So you can build a lot of like fake hype and excitement and validation which is better than doing nothing.
You're collecting email addresses.
Exactly, but you're collecting email addresses. So I wanted to make sure that what I was building was something people were actually willing to pay for. And so the idea was rather simple. It was to announce this idea that we were working on, to have the waitlist, but to have a second tier that we called founding memberships, where when we did launch, you would get $100 credited to your account, you get a Wander hoodie, you get certain community privileges, those different pieces, to see whether or not people were actually willing to pay for this product that we were launching. Like, how real was the signal? We ended up generating, I think it was $200,000 or $300,000 in founding memberships in like the month and a half ahead of launch. And again, that wasn't our business model. So the moment that we did launch, we like turned off founding memberships, and like those founding members, I still like so deeply value. Like, there will be like a big party at some point that I will throw for all those people who like gave us that like early belief. Many of them have invested like in the company. So there's like ways to keep that core community like
Those
important.
early adopters are the reason why startups are here, right?
Exactly right. But that was the purpose of it, was to make sure that we were building something that people wanted and were willing to pay for. Once we had actually launched the product, the first like 3 properties were instantly fully booked out.
And you already had an existing audience of those folks to basically
right.
say, guess what, here are the properties.
Yeah, exactly.
What was it about? Do you think it was the distribution, the message, the way you talked about what Wander is going to be? Because to get so many people, not just to put in their email address, but to actually give you $100 when there is nothing tangible they're getting back, that's incredible. What do you think was it about the way you executed this launch that resulted in that type of response?
I think the first thing was idea market fit. So there's a lot of talk about product market fit, but before product market fit, there's idea market fit. And so we had built something that had, or we had come up with an idea that had idea market fit. So from a marketing perspective, you need to articulate that to the user. Like, what is it that we're building? How is it different? Why would you be interested in this product? I also think that it was a problem that the majority of people have had. Like, when I talk to anyone about their vacation rental experience, like, everyone has a horror story or something that they're like unsatisfied with. And so I think that really deeply resonated with those consumers. And so, once we had shared the idea and sort of talked about where we were going, and they could see that we were going to make it real and they believed in the execution, then, I think from there, to your point, those early adopters like saw something that was real. You have like these people who are optimistic about the future. Obviously, the counterpoint is you have all the people who are unoptimistic about the future, but you have this core group that was super excited. And yeah, to your point, like, there is not a single company that would exist today that changed the world that would not exist without those folks who like believed and were excited and like encouraged that team, because that's what fueled us, right? Or like the excited tweets and all that sort of cool stuff.
I'm sure you guys get tons of repeat business, customers who are coming back, love the product, refer friends, all of that good stuff. But like, at this stage of the company, what are the main marketing channels that you use to get in front of new people?
There's a really wonderful book. It's called Traction, that sort of outlines what are all the various ways that you can get new customers and find them, from TV to referrals to whatever else. Ultimately, there are only so many channels, and then inside of each channel, there are a bunch of different like subcategories. So like on social media marketing, you have Twitter, Facebook, etc. And then within that, you have all different content strategies. And as you know, it's a massive, ever-changing field. The way that we do it is we definitely use a very multi-channel approach, with this idea that we want to relentlessly track what are our costs, what are basically the unit economics of each customer, and then make sure that all of our marketing spend is very profitable. We're, I would say, like, pretty dialed in at this point to those sort of core channels: influencer marketing, search ads, like those different pieces. But to find what content worked well, and those sort of nuances requires a ton of testing. But ultimately, at this point now for Wander, it's really just getting the idea in front of travelers who want to go and book a vacation rental. And so it's distributing that idea to them in the mediums that they already are consuming. So think, you're scrolling through Instagram or you're searching for vacation rentals in wine country, those different things. How do we ensure that Wander shows up to those users? What's really great is our NPS is remarkably high. It's in the mid 80s. And so that means that once a customer stays at a Wander, they tell like absolutely everyone, which is exactly what you want. So we do see a really great flywheel of once someone experiences a Wander, then the 100 people in their network then just like hear nothing about it, like becomes a part of their identity, which we're obviously like super, super grateful for.
And also it's a social experience, right? So a lot of times they will be doing it with their friends, family.
Exactly right. Yeah, they'll bring 5 to 10 people with them on said trip, and so that expands it pretty quickly.
How do you think about just content creation in general and the investment that you put into sort of organic content?
Content, I would say, is one of the most valuable forms of marketing. Original content specifically, obviously. When you look at the world that we're in today, the way that people find information, the way that these search engines are indexing, et cetera. Like even when you think about YouTube as an example, like YouTube is the second largest search engine. Even Spotify, when people search for podcasts or whatever else, is a search engine. And so everyone's looking for this unique and original content, this information that they can't find anywhere else. And so creating that information as a company is really important. That used to look a lot like just writing original blogs as an example, but nowadays almost everything is like indexable. And so whether it's a podcast like this or videos or even photos, which I find really fascinating. Obviously you have like Google Images and Pinterest and these companies that literally will like show the consumer photos that are relevant to them and then take them to whatever website those are hosted on. The interesting thing about content as well, as opposed to just performance marketing, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that you own that content at the end of the day. And I think that that's something that doesn't necessarily click with a lot of marketers, is this idea that when you spend money on a Google ad, the moment that someone clicks, that money is spent and it's gone. Versus when you spend money on content, at the end of the day, when someone clicks on that, you still own your content. So a really good way of thinking about it is like you own this stock that also issues a dividend, as opposed to something that just kind of goes away once it's used or only generates revenue for you once. And so if you can create this massive content library, then it can continue to support you and your company for a very long time. I think the easiest example of that would be like a Disney, who has a massive catalog of original content, and that is what fuels obviously that business. And I think that's something that every business can do.
It is a content business.
Absolutely.
So that's so interesting, because I also, by the way, think that works really well with influencer marketing. And I want to mention that the way I found Wander doing it is really smart, because I think that, and it makes just so much sense, right? Like it's almost, to me, it seems like for the kind of company you were building, going back to when you wrote that 80-page document, was there a lot there around marketing and content? Because I feel like you need to be that content brand.
There certainly was. So the way that I looked at it was through the lens of having a moat. So there are obviously different types of moats. You have distribution moats, technical moats, all these different things. For me, the way that I looked at each home on the platform was like an original piece of content, sort of like how you have these original shows on Netflix that are only on Netflix. The idea was, could we have a bunch of exclusive inventory that was just original content to Wander? And then taking that idea even further, could we then create content and marketing around that specific thing so that when someone went onto our marketplace, they were like, oh, I think I'm going to watch that, or I think I'm going to experience this home. So really thinking about the homes as content and content engines in their own right, and sort of this idea that it was the home that was marketing to the consumer, as opposed to marketing Wander as a single idea. And what's interesting is that's the same idea behind like an Architectural Digest, right? When you think about Architectural Digest, the reason why the brand is so strong is because the homes are remarkable. And so it was really taking that idea and bringing it to Wander.
I love that.
I would love for Wander to be, like the Wander Concierge, to be useful even when people aren't staying at a Wander. Like I would love the idea that you're like, hey, I just like want to go and book a dinner reservation. I'm just going to like message the Wander Concierge and have them go and take care of it for me.
That's amazing. I mean, now I'm actually immediately thinking from the It's like a lot of products create like free. I mean, it's the free product that is adjacent to your main product. That could be just Wander Concierge available to anyone, and suddenly, I'm still in the marketing.
No, it's about this idea of it takes advantage. So going back to the idea of moats, you want to take advantage of whatever moats you can create with your strategy. By building our own platform, one of the moats we created is this idea of a distribution moat. It's the same reason why when Apple released Apple Music, it became bigger than Spotify overnight, is because Apple had this massive distribution moat to everyone who had an iPhone. And so for Wander, any product we release is now instantly going to 250,000 users. And so that's very powerful. And so if we want to create all of these enrichments into our AI concierge, such as being able to book flights or dinner reservations or the like, now we have a distribution mode to 250,000 plus, high net worth travelers.
And they're also not just, they're very highly engaged with your brand.
Absolutely.
Obviously.
Now, I think I do want to note in the space of AI, because it's one of those things where I think AI is moving so quickly that like Siri will be able to go and book your flights and dinner reservations. Google, Gemini, or whatever they call it, in its final version, will be able to do the same thing. Alexa will be able to do the same thing. There will be so many like AI assistants that can do.
And startups are going to do a bunch of
startups. There's going to be so many pieces. So you can't think about it in terms of, is this my product? You have to think about it in terms of what are users going to expect down the line. And the interesting thing is that users' expectations, because of how advanced all these systems will get, will be that if I cannot book a private chef through my AI Wander concierge, then like this platform is old and outdated. And so that's really the mindset that we're building these things in, not in the sense of like, oh, this is going to be its own standalone product and compete with, Apple's eventual assistant and ChatGPT and all those different things. It's really around this idea of customer expectations in the world of like AI and technology are rising so quickly that as a consumer company, if you don't have these features, you're going to end up behind.
After hearing all of this and after experiencing Wander myself, I definitely don't want to be your competitor, to be honest. You guys have elevated the expectations for customers, for guests. And I'm just curious, when you're doing that, when you're deciding like, okay, what's the new way that we will innovate for our guests, surprise and delight, etc., do you take that inspiration from customer feedback? Is it your vision? Is it a mix of both? Like, what is it?
I think in the world of startups, there are two potential customers, one that you know nothing about, and the other that is very similar to you, right? This idea that you are your own customer. Mm-hmm. For example, in my first company, Coder, our customers were large Fortune 500 companies with tens of thousands of software engineers. I have never worked at a Fortune 500 company. We were not a Fortune 500 company. We knew nothing about the security practices and the like. And so every conversation was discovery. I think that's where that like Y Combinator concept of go and talk to your customer is like such an important one, because otherwise you're just flying blind. The other set of customer are the ones that are like you, right? This idea of I have good taste. I know what I want. I know what I like. I also know what other people like in this category. And so I have a vision for a better option. One of the great examples I always love to share is, when Henry Ford asked, people what they wanted for transportation, they always said a faster horse, right? They didn't say the car. And so you do need to, at some point, recognize when do you know what your customers want, and then build that. And then the other is when do you have absolutely no idea what they want and you want to validate and ask them. In the early days of a startup, you need to identify which one of those it is very quickly. And then obviously you can build based on that. You always want to validate and check along the way that idea of seeing if you have idea market fit, sharing, asking questions, say, hey, this is what I'm building. What do you think? I can't tell you how many emails I sent to our broad user group of like, hey, I'm thinking about launching this feature. What do you think? Getting those replies, like taking those into consideration. For the most part, Wander has been a vision company as opposed to an iterative company, in the sense of like I had a very clear vision of what I wanted the experience and the product to be like. And then that ended up resonating with consumers. And of course, we validated it over time. Now, of course, with a vision company, what you can get is a lot of things that don't scale. Like I always think about, Steve Jobs, like being like the font needs to be like this or X, Y, Z. And so it can be
Very OCD about every little
exactly.
detail.
And so it can be slow, it can be difficult to scale. Wander obviously was very similar, right? Like you want to deliver this 11-star customer experience. You want to give the customers the world, but ultimately as you scale from adding one location a month to 20 a month, you need to start cutting some of those pieces. And then the hard part is, what do you cut? And that's when you have to talk to customers and understand, like, what do they actually care about? Like in Wander's case, we, I think when you went and visited Calistoga Valley, you mentioned that you saw like a Tesla there. Like when we started, we wanted to deliver the most extreme like experience you could imagine. And so we wanted every property to have a Tesla, all these different pieces. I mean, you could even control all the lights right through your phone, like all the smart home technology. Like it was really epic. And the fact that an early startup built that, had an integration with Tesla, et cetera, was like pretty wild.
Yeah.
But as we...
And definitely not something people expected, right? You're almost
Exactly.
like, wow, all of this is here for
We
me.
almost started with like the perfect product first, which I think is ironic. And
The
then, like,
anti-MVP.
yeah, exactly. I think the version that was MVP was how small it was, like how few properties it was in Wander's case, which I find really interesting, versus like a software product that follows that vein. Is like could scale to millions of users.
It's almost like narrowing the scope by narrowing the number
size.
of properties.
Yeah, exactly.
But then delivering everything you could even
exactly
imagine.
And then having all the data that like action created to be able to make those decisions. Ultimately as we scaled and we asked customers did they care, like they ended up not caring as much. Like really what they wanted at the end of the day was incredible customer support, cleanliness, consistency, and the underlying quality of the home. And then there were certain Wander standards like beds and linens and towels that they wanted to be consistent. But beyond that, like those sort of like frilly features didn't actually have any impact on our NPS or CSAT. And it was really interesting when we took those features away, not seeing that drop in CSAT, just saying everything sort of stay the same. And so I think that, candidly speaking, that's probably something that most founders should do, is take a hard look at their product and say, okay, as we scale, what pieces of this don't scale very well, or what pieces of the product are hard to maintain? And if we got rid of this, would it actually affect our NPS? Would it actually affect our CSAT?
Maybe it simplifies your operation. It makes
Exactly.
things a lot easier. That is not something I would agree. That's not what people usually talk about. It's usually the other way around when they offer very little, sort of like the MVP land, and then you add. But I think in your category, with your kind of company, you had to do it this way. And I also think that all the details, like all the amenities, everything you do at Wander, created a lot of word of mouth. So even if you maybe remove some of those things, you've created a brand around
Totally.
that. Like people now view Wander as this like insanely high-end experience.
Yeah. And I think the cool thing is like, obviously we continue to deliver on that, but it's all around this idea that to create a really beautiful and strong brand, you have to deliver a great product. Like you cannot have a good brand and a bad product. And so the two kind of go hand in hand.
I have to ask you about your journey and the differences between being a first-time founder and a second-time founder. And one thing that I want to share is I was in touch with Kyle, your CMO, and I asked him, what is your founder superpower? Do you want to guess what he said?
I do not. I have no idea.
So he said something which I think is amazing and makes so much sense for me. He just said you're an execution machine, and you like velocity and ability to take an ambitious vision and break it down into a timeline that's a lot shorter than what people anticipate. He mentioned that as your superpower, and I think like every founder wants to have that superpower. So what is your secret?
Well, first of all, I'm super flattered. Kyle is being way too kind.
So sometimes I find it's easier to know based on the folks you work with versus like yourself. If I asked you that question, maybe you would be very humble.
Yeah, I think the idea of giving some type of like self-flattering answer is not my personality.
Yeah, I figured. Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, you really do want to break down some large problem into a bunch of smaller problems. And I think that mental framework isn't just something that's relevant in business, but it's also relevant in life. Like, okay, I want to be here in 5 years. Like, that seems impossible until you break down the individual steps. I would say that I spend a phenomenal amount of time in the future to the point where like I actually think that it's like a little bit of a con, like not a superpower, like how much time I spend thinking about the future, both in terms of the company and also my life. Like I think I've lived my life like a million times in my head at this point. And so, I would say that that level of clarity really does help break down what types of actions and goals I think are important for the company. It also allows for us to assign probabilities of success to various outcomes, and to my point earlier, run different things in parallel to make sure that the company never seems to miss a beat, even when 4 out of the 5 things we started failed, which I think is why, like, to an outsider looking in at Wander, or really any of my previous companies, they see something that always moved forward. And so it always seems like we always had the answer, when in reality, we didn't have the answer, and we knew we didn't have the answer. We just knew that one of the 3 variables was going to be correct. And so we did all 3 at once. And that allowed us to just keep moving forward.
And momentum breeds momentum. So the fact that you did that then made it easier for you to have the other set of assumptions and hypotheses to be tested.
And there are certain things, like on the topic of speed, that I just believe in. I think that there's a lot of busy work that's done inside of companies. Like if something doesn't move the needle, I tell the team that like I do not want us to think about it. We call it fake work inside of the company. And so like now we have a culture where people, like if they see some type of busy work like being assigned, they'll just be like, this is fake work, which I find very funny.
You should also like get like a Slack emoji.
We
for
do.
that.
Someone created one. Yeah, I will never use it, obviously, but the rest of the company does. But yeah, it's all about this idea of laser focus on outputs, not inputs. I think that's also something that there's a little bit of like back and forth about inside of company building, or even as an individual, is you want to measure your output. Obviously, you want to do inputs to get you toward those outputs, but you have to measure the output to know if the input is even productive, right? Like, for example, if someone is starting an exercise regimen with the goal of lifting 100 pounds, but their success criteria that they're measuring is the fact that they go on a walk every day. It's like, yeah, you did all the inputs, but when you measure that output, you're no closer to lifting those 100 pounds. And so in a company building, it's all about saying like, what are the outputs? What are the specific goals that we want to get done? What are the KPIs and metrics and things that we need to do? And then from there, figuring out what the like inputs are and if they have a positive effect. So I would say that that's really like what leads to Wander speed. Is I spend a lot of time thinking about the future. I encourage the company to. We assign a probability to those futures and then basically chase down whichever ones we think are the most likely. And if there are multiple that are unlikely but very important, then we'll chase down multiple at the same time. And then from there, it's cutting out all busy, all sort of quote unquote fake work, those different pieces to ensure that everything we're doing is highly productive.
Yeah, I think it sounds, and I mean at the end of the day, you need to do it in your context. It's one of those things that is just so hard.
Oh, it's remarkably difficult. It all,
especially as your company is growing.
It all boils down to clarity, and I think also culturally not being afraid of getting rid of what I think are a lot of like very basic corporate rituals. I think that like we talked a little bit about this idea of like one-on-ones as like an example, which this can be like a very controversial topic.
Oh, this is so controversial. Yeah.
Like, ultimately for me, like pre-scheduled meetings are very difficult because they can sort of take you out of flow. They can sort of, kind of corrupt your calendar. And so like when I need to talk to an executive, what I encourage is the idea of like, hey, if we need to talk, let's like talk unscheduled versus having something that's like recurring on the calendar. And what ends up happening is let's say that we can even save 1 hour a week by potentially skipping something that was pre-scheduled or the like, and you take that and you multiply it across a 70 plus person company, you end up with just a lot of extra efficiency. And so there are all those little types of like very comfortable corporate rituals you have to kind of take a deeper look at and have a little bit of courage and say, okay, like we're going to try to execute without this and see what happens.
So you have, how many team members do you have at this point?
I think we have about 70.
17. No one-on-ones.
I do not do any one-on-ones in the traditional sense. So when I say something like that, everyone thinks like John Andrew just doesn't talk to anyone ever.
Yeah, you don't talk to people.
Which is obviously like false. The way that it works is that, when someone in the company needs to talk to me, they know that for the most part, my calendar is empty, and they can reach out to me at any time, whether it's 3 a.m. in the morning or in the middle of the workday, and I will answer, whether it's a Slack huddle or a phone call or the like, and we'll problem solve. If they have some personal thing going on, we'll talk through it, and then it's resolved, and then the world continues. And so, like, ultimately, for me and for the team, they know that I'm accessible. They know that I care. Like, they know that I'm very reachable, and that in the same way, like, let's say you and your friends don't have some reoccurring meeting on the calendar. Some people may, and I think that's totally fine. But let's like on average,
you don't send Calendly to your friends?
Not for any type of recurring thing. I'll use like my pop as an example. Like me and my pop don't have a recurring one-on-one in the calendar. I will just call him when I want to talk to him, and that is the same sort of virtue that we have inside of Wander. And we also keep everyone very aligned on their tasks and responsibilities. All of our communication is very like asynchronous. And what ends up happening is you have a culture of freedom where, again, what we measure are the outputs, not the inputs. And so for a team of very effective people, you have this like total autonomy. Like I sort of tell the team that like there is no concept of a work day. It's like you get your work done when you're most productive. You talk to people when you need to talk to people. Like if you can't join a certain, like, if you want to share something with the team, like a presentation, like record a video of yourself and share it with them. And so you create this like constantly evolving, constantly like moving machine. To be clear, like there are obviously like cultural dynamics where that works and where that doesn't. And you can't, it's all about the type of people that you hire and whether or not they're productive in that environment. I like to talk about this example of like certain trees grow well in certain environments, and in other environments they don't grow well at all. And that doesn't mean that it's a bad tree. It just means that like some environment may be good for some people and some environments may not be good for others.
There are people who would probably love what you're describing, and others who would say, hey,
it's tough.
Yeah,
like
it's really tough.
A fast-moving, autonomous, asynchronous environment is some people's dream. The idea of like, I'm not being micromanaged, I don't have a calendar full of meetings. Like for some people, that's really exciting. And then for other people, they need a little bit more structure. And that doesn't mean that they're not productive or incredible people. It just means that a company like Wander may be a little bit more challenging.
John Andrew now as a second-time founder versus John Andrew at Coder, what's the biggest difference?
I think that I would say that it's less of some separation in those 3 months between like exiting Coder and starting Wander as like, oh, I just went through like some radical transformation as a founder in those 3 months that made me better. I think what's interesting is this idea that it's about time. Like it's about getting your 10,000 plus hours in as a founder.
So it's a very gradual journey if someone
Exactly right. And so like for me, I've been running companies, obviously when I was like 13, 14, like I would not say that I was a good CEO. To be clear, like ethically and culturally, like I'm the same exact kid. Like I love people. Like I always like speak softly. Like I'm the same individual. But like as I've grown, I've become more intelligent, a deeper understanding. I've read like more books. I've had more conversations. I've like fallen more times than I can count. And so that makes you a different type of leader as you go. I've also, at this point, been through the journey of, pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B. At some point, I'm going to hit the threshold of having been there and done that, which you would expect, right? I'm still, relatively young. I'm 26. Like, I haven't ran a public company as an example. And so, like,
Not yet.
not yet. Well, hopefully one day I'm lucky enough. But the idea is that when I get there, it's not exactly like I'm going to be like an expert. And so
There's always a first time for that new stage.
exactly. And so I think that, like, there are certainly lessons that I've learned, like running companies and running multiple companies definitely totally shifts your perception. It like rewires your brain in a really interesting way. Mostly, I think, because as a founder, your brain forms around company A, and then like all of a sudden now you're working on something entirely new, and you kind of zoom out to a different degree. But I would say for me, I ran this company, I ran Wander in a very unafraid way. I developed opinions that were potentially a little bit contrarian, like wanting to limit one-on-ones as an example, or wanting to structure them in a very different way, and had the confidence to actually go and execute on that, as opposed to, I think, a lot of first-time founders may not have the confidence to do that, and they're trying to work inside of a structure that simply doesn't work for who they are or their management style or their team because it's like the industry standard. So I would say that type of confidence, I would say prioritizing different things from a team perspective and cultural perspective. Yeah, there's a lot.
What's the difference in how you hire? Because I think that's obviously the something that I know every founder talks about, things they wish they knew, mistakes they've made. What's the difference if you compare to your hiring process or hiring philosophy at Wander compared to previously at Coder?
I think that cultural alignment is really important. And what I mean by that is the idea of like shared ethics. Like, I like to work with the type of people who, if they're driving down the highway and they see someone with a flat tire, they like can't help but want to stop and pull over. Like, that's who I am. Those are the type of people that I want to hire. And I will prioritize those attributes over like skill set every day of the week. Because ultimately what you get is a team with very aligned ethics and like who they want to be as a person. And that, obviously translates into who the company is and what those things look like. And so I would say that that was a very radically different piece. Like, as an early stage founder, your first time around, you maybe hire that engineer who's not exactly a good cultural fit, just because they're so skilled. But in reality, that will end up really harming your company in the long run, because at the end of the day, a company is just a group of people serving other people, aka your customers. Like, that's all it is. And so if you don't have like a true people first, like ethics first belief, then you're gonna really struggle.
Yeah. I'm sure everyone wants to hire those incredibly kind, empathetic people. I think, I can't imagine someone would say they don't. So, but the challenge is, how do you get those signals when you're talking to them during the interview process? How do you know before they're at the company that, hey, this person is perfect for our culture? Do you have any tips for that?
I ask exceptionally direct questions. I think that like one of the big mistakes that people make when interviewing is that they ask very roundabout questions, or they kind of like touch and feel and see, and it's like they treat it like a game of poker. And it's like, if you're the type of company that you want people to, like, let's say an example, if you're an early stage company, you may have times where people need to work on the weekends, and that's just like how it goes. But you obviously don't want to have a culture where you're telling people they have to work on the weekends and they hate you, because that's not a great vibe. So you want to hire people who understand that, hey, I may have to work on the weekend for this role in this company, and is that something you want or not? So rather than like asking some convoluted question about like, who is the hardest working person that you know, and then trying to extract like, is that person good or not, like, I will just
people would ask that?
as an interview question. I would just ask the question of like, hey, sometimes we have to work on the weekends as an early stage company, to reach your goals. We're not going to tell you that you have to, but it may be obvious if you're falling behind. Like, is that something that you're okay with? And then people may say yes or no. And based on that answer, you can make a very clear decision about whether or not they're going to work for you at that stage.
And hopefully people are self-aware enough to also know, like, hey, is this going to work for me?
People really are. I think that that's also part of the problem with companies and interviewers. The goal is not to convince the person to join. Like, I think a lot of interviewers get stuck in like sell mode and they don't want to scare the candidate. Like,
Oh,
it is
like we're all great. Everything is great.
exactly.
Kombucha on tap.
Yeah, you wanna communicate the reality of the role to the candidate as effectively as you can, and you want to ask as many questions as you can to ensure that you're getting past the, like, everyone wants to do a great job in a job interview, obviously, and you kind of have to tell them, and what I tell candidates at the beginning of an interview process is the goal is not to get hired. The goal is for you and I to figure out if this is like a match made in heaven on both sides. And that kind of shifts their perspective to saying, okay, I'm interviewing you and you're interviewing me, and let's figure out if this is my forever career. And that's one thing that I also tell the team is that, like, I want Wander to be the last place that you ever work. Like, I want it to be such a great fit that this is like, you're going to have a 30+ year career here and then you're going to retire. And so in that sense, like, we really need to figure out if this is the right place.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, it almost is so obvious, but sometimes you forget. And I think it's very natural for you as I'll tell you from my experience, for me as an interviewer, I feel like you almost immediately go into the sell mode, but that's a mistake because when things, of course, it's when you're joining a startup, it's a roller coaster at the end of the day. So
100%.
if the person is not there for the tough times, yeah, you have to be transparent and say, hey, like, you need to love this, and this may look different day in, day out.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think in your situation as well, I know you don't have co-founders.
That's
right?
correct.
So does it get lonely?
I want to note, even though I don't have like direct co-founders, I do have the most remarkable team in the world. So I am far from alone. I mean, my executive team is amazing. Like, the entire team, our shareholders, our board, our customers. And so I want to make that like very clear. I know that like a lot of times the CEO and the founder can be put on a pedestal, especially if they're like a solo founder. But like, I really do truly view it that all I'm doing is like representing the great work of our team. And so, like, yeah, without them, I would be nothing, obviously. In fact, I like still think I'm nothing because of that mindset. I'm just like, I'm just here to help them do their work. But to that end, there are some times where like the weight of the world does like fall on your shoulders, and like you are sort of a little bit like alone and isolated. And yeah, I mean, it can be difficult, like when you're like, staring out, trying to solve a hard problem, or you are in one of those, moments where you think the company is going to fail and it's just on you. One of our core company virtues at Wander is no one is coming to save you, which can sound like pretty hardcore.
It does sound hardcore.
But ultimately it's true. Like, if you have a project that you need to do and you're the one responsible for it, then it's like you kind of have to like, button down and say like, okay, like it's on me. And I actually think that there's a lot of freedom in knowing that like you are responsible and the product that you create is yours. And like, if you win, if you can get out of this, and obviously like people will help you, but like it's yours, it can be like a really exciting outcome. But yeah, as a solo founder, it's a little bit more difficult, but I'm exceptionally lucky to have such an amazing team. And like, candidly speaking, I don't even know what this idea of founder like even means at this point. So
you're all in it together,
we're all in it.
And it takes everyone working together to do what you do. Maybe on a lighter note, I'm very excited to follow your journey, your personal journey, the company journey. Is there something that's coming maybe in the future for Wander that you are most excited about? Is there maybe a location you're really looking forward to launching, or what gets you excited about the next couple of months?
I'm remarkably excited about the company. Obviously, I think for us right now, it's really the pace of scale. We're growing about 30% every month right now in terms of portfolio growth, which is really outstanding. And from there, I think Wander becoming culturally relevant to so many people, like being able to open the Wander app and have a location where you want to go is like going to be really exciting to folks. We were talking about having locations in Canada and the like at some point.
I would love that.
Exactly.
Please.
So it's this idea of just really expanding all across the globe. And I think from a technology perspective and a user delight perspective, adding in those features like we talked about with like AI concierge and dinner reservations, all those cool things that just make people like happy and inspired and excited to like get out and explore this beautiful world. Because ultimately, like I think that's the reason why Wander exists, right? It's like I want to build more infrastructure for people to experience the world because I think that that's such an important part of like being a human.
Sure. Before we wrap up, you travel a ton. You're always on the go, and a lot of founders do as well. Do you have a tip for founders who do a lot of traveling, a lot of business travel?
I do.
Outside of using, obviously, staying at a Wander.
I would say the best piece of travel advice that I could possibly give, and this is like, it's going to sound kind of funny, is that airline seats are really hard, as like I think we've all experienced. So if you're on like a 6-hour flight, it's like very uncomfortable. They have these inflatable seat cushions that like roll up very small in your backpack, and you can just pop it out and like sit on it. And it is life changing. Like I fly probably 20 times a month, and like, yeah, you look a little bit like a, like a weirdo, like with your inflatable seat cushion. But then like when everyone is like aching, like, and you're kind of like, feel like you're on this couch, it's pretty luxe. So
that's amazing.
That would be my like biggest travel
I feel
hack.
like when you know what you're doing, then you came prepared, you know what you're doing. I was wondering why, like these long flights, it's like you get out of the plane
You're
and
so sore.
You're done.
You're like, I can sit on this couch for 8 hours, I'd be fine. But
Totally.
an airline seat, very difficult. And the reason they do it is to save weight. Like they take the foam out because foam is very heavy. And so
just bring it with you.
And yeah, exactly.
Love it. Oh, that's very practical. I have a flight coming up. Maybe I'm gonna see if I can.
I have a brand for you. I'll share it after.
You have a brand. Love it. For folks listening, watching, if they want to learn more about Wander, about you, follow your journey, what are the best things for them to do?
Wander's website is wander.com, and it's at Wander on all the different social channels. So that's pretty simple. And then yeah, for me, I'm a pretty boring person to follow on social.
Do you post a lot on social, or?
I mostly just retweet Wander.
Yeah, so. that's right. Do you like all the mentions of Wander on Twitter?
Of course, yeah. I'm a good founder. It's like watching my kid like win a soccer game or something.
I'm glad you're saying it. I do that, and like my Twitter has become basically it, and I'm here for that phase of like.
I'm like a proud mom. Like yeah, that's cool.
It's amazing. Thank you for joining. Had a great time talking to you, and I look forward to following your journey and can't wait for Wander in Canada. I'm gonna ask you about that.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time.